views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. Tonight's guest is a longtime state legislator who is the leader of the Independent Democratic Conference in the state Senate, and he is the senator from the 34th Senatorial District. Of course, it's Jeff Klein. We'll talk with him about state politics and his conference, the latest legislation, his daycare center report card, ethics reform, the minimum wage, and a lot more. If you have questions or comments, you send an email to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org or post it on our Facebook page, and we'll read it on the air during a future edition of our program. For the here and now, the leader of the Independent Democratic Conference in Albany, the senator from the 34th District in the Bronx. If you don't know, it includes the Bronx neighborhoods of Kingsbridge, Van Cortlandt Village, Riverdale, Morris Park, City Island, Throgs Neck, and even parts of Soundview and Hunts Point's a large district. Welcome back to Bronx Talk,
Pleasure,
Senator
Gary.
Jeff Klein.
Pleasure to be back.
Nice to have you with us. Before we get to local issues, what are your thoughts on the police shootings of black men in Louisiana and Minnesota, and then the subsequent ambush of 5 Dallas police officers?
Both horrible tragedies, and I think we need to understand that when a civilian is killed by law enforcement, we need to weep. We need to do something about it. But I think we also have to understand that police officers who dedicate their lives to protecting us have to really have the same dignity. And I think the only way we're going to come together as one and really solve these problems of police brutality, of police officers having their lives taken by snipers, is really working together, and I think that's what we really need to do. I go way back where I was one of the people who was arrested for civil disobedience during the Amadou Diallo debacle and horrible tragedy that took place. And I think it led to some reforms. I think it led to some positive changes in the police force. But I think, there's always ways that we need to make sure that the community is more engaged in local law enforcement. I'm a firm believer in something as simple as the Explorer program. Making sure that young people learn what it means to be a police officer, respect law enforcement. So I've always been helpful in organizing all of those types of auxiliary police and everything else in our district. I think that's the only way we're going to come together.
To me, one of the bottom lines is guns. And in every one of those incidents, whether it was a police officer with a gun or it was the person who shot the police officers, is guns. And in fact, today the commissioner of police in Dallas said that the open carry law in Texas is not very helpful in this whole process. New York State has among maybe the toughest gun laws in the country. What needs to be done? Is there anything you can do? Is there anything the state can do at this point when, in many ways, we've led the country on it?
That's a very important segue for me. I was the Senate sponsor of the SAFE Act. It's probably one of the pieces of legislation I'm most proud of in my entire career. Banning assault weapons, banning high-capacity magazines, getting guns out of the hands of the criminally mentally ill. That's what it all does. It takes a real balanced approach. It deals, I think, with the whole issue of community guns. We're enhancing penalties for leaving a gun in a specific place. No, you could use it by other gang members. Enhancing the penalties, making it a felony for carrying a gun near a school or on a bus. These are things that we need to do, and I think we did send a strong message that New York is going to do everything we can to prevent gun violence, but other states really have to follow suit. And when you have the Congress of the United States not being able to pass a common sense gun law, just background checks, and have to have a sit-in to be able to even try to do it, and they still can't get it done, I think that sends a very horrible message about dysfunction in our really in Washington. And I think it really shows what we can get done here in New York when we put our mind to it. like comprehensive gun control.
You know, I'll say somewhat sarcastically, maybe even more dysfunctional than some of the arguments that you have in Albany that seem to go around in circles.
Well, I don't think that's the case, and then we'll talk about that.
All right, well, so let's talk about the legislative process that got us a flurry of activity at the end of the session. For many years, residents of the state and legislators as well have decried the idea of 3 men in a room that decide and negotiate many of the state's biggest issues. Now, with your conference, there are 4 men in the room. Describe what happened in Albany, maybe specifically during the last week, what role your conference was able to play in this whole process.
Well, again, I think you really outlined it a little earlier as far as something as important as gun control, the inability to get anything done. And, you know, I think if you take a step back, Gary, and you see, you know, why are people so upset? Why are people so angry? I think they see their elected officials going off to Washington and not being able to get things done. Really just playing partisan politics each and every day and never coming together. You know, I'm a Democrat. I want to elect Democrats. Republicans want to elect Republicans. But I think the public wants to see us get things done once the election is over. And I think we've been able to achieve that in the Independent Democratic Conference. Over our 6 years, we've been able to bridge the gap, getting Republicans to support something like comprehensive gun control law, a $15 minimum wage, which now they can only dream of getting done on a national level. Paid family leave, something that I didn't stop fighting for 3 years. Making sure that the hardest working New Yorkers now don't have to choose between what their pocketbook allows them to do and what their heart is telling them to do. So I think all of these things are extremely important. We also were able to do the largest middle income tax cut in the state's history. Over $3 billion in tax cuts for income taxes in the state of New York over the next 3 years. So we've accomplished a lot, and people talk about the dysfunction. Well, I think dysfunction means that you don't get things done. And you sit back and you just play political games and fight back and forth like they're doing in Congress, having sit-ins, which I respect them for because I agree with the issue. But at the same time, when you have a president of the United States not being able to confirm his own Supreme Court nominee, that's a problem. So I don't consider what we've been able to accomplish this last year as dysfunction. I think it's probably one of the most successful legislative accomplishments in my history in the legislature, and I'm glad to be part of it.
We'll break some of that down. Maybe you could, which I think would really be fascinating, we hear about the 3 or 4 men in a room. Describe what that negotiation is like, whether you want to talk about a specific piece of legislation. Do you 4 literally sit around the table? You know, are you the one who breaks the tie, so to speak?
Well,
give me an idea of what that looks like, and I think viewers would really appreciate that because it would take some of the mystery out of it.
Well,
and you're there, so I want to
think,
know.
again, I think, Gary, since the beginning of time, since we started our democratic process, different legislative bodies elect leaders. And those leaders, at the call of the governor, sit down in a room in the governor's office and work on the budget. You know, it's usually the big picture items. It's not secretive because it's usually the issues that everyone has been talking about. We spent most of our time in this budget process as far as the so-called 4 men in a room, talking about increasing the minimum wage to $15, something I supported wholeheartedly. Making sure that we actually were able to get paid family leave finally done, something I fought for 3 years. But then the Republicans turned around and said, you want to know something? We need to cut taxes. They hear that from their constituents. So let's give a tax cut to anyone who makes under $300,000. Which is actually going to be a 25% tax cut for that income
Something
bracket
you support.
over the next 3 years, which I support as well. So I think it's a balanced approach to governing, and those are the things that we talk about.
So,
you know, do we want to also advocate, like I do now, that I'm there for the Bronx? I want to make sure we get projects for the Bronx, monies for parks, things of that nature. Absolutely, I'm going to.
I would assume that
and
you...
Carl Hasty does the same for the Bronx
I assume you
as
have
well.
a colleague there.
You know, just last year we were able to get $350 million, the only ad in the MTA budget for 4 new Metro North stations in the Bronx: Parkchester, Co-op City, Hunts Point, and Morris Park. These are things that, you know, we advocate for in that, you know, so-called room in the governor's office.
Some people would say that the 1-year extension for mayoral control of schools would be an example of dysfunction. Others are saying certainly that this is part and parcel to the feud between the mayor and the governor. Recently, just along those same lines, the governor accused the mayor of playing politics over daycare legislation. Then Speaker Hasty put out a release accusing the governor of the same thing. this can't be good for
I will
New York City?
I will cover each of them in turn. First and foremost, mayoral control, supported wholeheartedly. Something as important as education should be under the auspices of the mayor. I got tired of mayors in the past throwing up their hands and saying, well, it's not me, it's the Board of Education.
And blame them.
Exactly. However, I thought we could have made some changes, and the changes that I wanted to make was to enhance parental engagement, having the CECs more in sync with our community boards, which are very, very active entities in our communities. The Republicans, I have to say, in some ways, made it about politics. They didn't like the mayor very much and actually only gave him a one-year extension. But at the same time, even some of those extensions that we did some make changes. And I want to tell you what the big battle was about. And I don't hold my Republican colleagues, responsible for that. We wanted transparency. The Republicans
state now
decided,
has oversight,
right? The Republicans decided no. The Republicans decided that before the budget is passed, that the Department of Education in the City of New York present to the City Council, the local legislative body, a spending breakdown, district by district, so we can see where the money is going. I didn't think that was such a big thing. I didn't think that was a slap in the face of the mayor. It was transparency. It's a good thing. So there's a little, I think you have to take sort of this even approach, which I try to do. Daycare. That's something that I worked on,
Well,
for
we
the
certainly
past
know
year.
that that's it, and I'm going to get to that, but I just want to stick with this mayor
control,
governor
okay.
thing. The governor put out, and it didn't stick, and I'm sure you would have been against it, and I'm sure you were against it, this idea of cutting $500 million from CUNY. I mean, that was, to me, was just saying to the mayor, giving him one of these. Does one of them need to back off, or how do we get the mayor and the governor to play ball?
I think what you need to
Without
do...
using
well,
us as the football.
I'll tell you, I can only say what I do. When something I believe is right, when I think it's a better way to get things done, well, I'm supportive, yes. When the governor proposed that he was going to cut $300 million for CUNY, in return, what he was doing was he wanted efficiency. He wanted an efficiency task force in place, which he got. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we hear a lot of teachers, especially professors in CUNY, saying, hey, how come the money's not going to the classroom? Why is it all going to administration? So now I think we're going to find out how that money is actually spent in CUNY. So I don't think that's a bad thing. But I think the governor went around it in a way, okay, I'm going to do this.
It ended up on the front page of the tabloids.
Exactly, so I can get this efficiency. This daycare mess is totally out of line, and I support the governor wholeheartedly on this. As somebody who represents the city of New York by and large, and I did a comprehensive study that showed the problems in daycares. Daycare centers.
I want to ask you about this.
And I turned around,
card,
yeah,
right?
well, I was able to negotiate that with the city because I knew full well that the city was not going to accept the enforcement mechanism. They told me so. So I figured, hey, at least if we provide some transparency, we can get that done. We have an agreed upon bill. That's going to be the law. The governor's going to sign it. However, if the governor turns around and now says, I want to make sure, have the authority to close down bad daycare centers, what's wrong with that? That's not a shot at the mayor. That's making, I think, the process work a hell of a lot better. Remember something, I've been active on this issue for some time and did a statewide study. I actually got my transparency done, posting requirements done outside of New York City because New York City never wanted to do it. New York City is the only entity that has their locality, local Department of Health, actually inspect daycares. Everyone else is done by the state. So if we're going to turn around and have oversight on these horrible daycare centers, the really bad ones, I think at the end of the day we're helping parents, we're helping kids.
How does that work? How does this work so that a consumer says, well, wait a minute, I need daycare for my kids. I want to maybe use this one or this one. There are a number of choices in my neighborhood. How does it work?
Up until before this, we had absolutely no transparency. No one knew. Something as important as daycare,
that's why I'm asking.
where young people have nothing new. Now we're going to have a real report card posted on every doorway of every daycare center with their license number, because we had a problem with unlicensed daycares. Now they have to prove they're actually licensed by having their number. We're also now going to have hazardous violations actually listed, the average of general violations, a true, the teacher to student ratio. Because there's
And
a lot of
people can go to a
overcrowding.
website, is that where it is?
Well, they can go to a website, but they can actually, I think, kind of vote with their feet by showing up at a local daycare, reading it, right in front of the daycare and determine how good or how bad. We had daycare centers lying about their
sure.
inspections.
And then how is that information gathered? There will be people.
There's going to be a special website that's going to have this
I
report card posted, as well as a posting on the actual daycare.
We still didn't get what many people would consider real ethics reform in the state. The LLC loophole in campaign finance still exists. Do you think the governor really wanted to get this done?
I think, again, I can only speak for myself. I certainly,
Did you want to get
yes, I spent a lot of time, working on getting a public matching system in New York, banning the LLC, the so-called LLC loophole, actually lowering contributions. As a matter of fact, I think my package was the most comprehensive. We're lowering contributions to $2,600 across the board, just like the federal level. Again, I think it's very clear, Gary, the Republicans are in no mood to do any campaign finance reform. They don't want a public matching system. They don't want to close the LLC loophole. They're in charge. They have 32. It's frustrating. But you know something? You don't just sit back and say, well, we're a total failure. You actually figure out ways you can get positive things done, like the minimum wage, like gun control, like middle-class tax cuts, like paid family leave. Hey, I'm still hopeful in the next legislative session, because, by the way, we still don't even have 32 Democrats, or all the Democrats in the Senate. They're in favor of full-blown campaign finance reform. I hope we can get it done.
You supported the idea of limiting outside income for legislators, if I remember correctly,
Yes.
and you actually gave up your...
Gave up my law practice.
Others who I've interviewed in this, they sat in the same seat you're sitting in, said, you know what, we don't really make enough, and I kind of need that income. What are your thoughts about it? Do you think that's ever the kind of thing that can spread through Albany?
Things have changed, and I think we really need to make sure there is absolutely no conflict whatsoever. I had a small law practice. We did some wills, we did estates, we did some personal injury. Never had any business before the state or any business that had any business before the city or anything else. And at the same time, I thought, hey, it's time to, I think, be a full-time legislator. Yes, the pay isn't that great, especially if you live in New York City. But you know something? It's public service.
You felt it was the right thing to do.
You don't do it for the money. And I was trying to lead by example. I think the time, will eventually come where we will be a full-time legislature with a pay increase that would be comparable to being a full-time. And I'm in favor of banning all outside income. So it's not only for lawyers. What bothers me always, it's always about lawyers somehow.
Well, because many legislators are lawyers.
But it can be not any longer. It can be a conflict if you're a professor, a real estate agent selling insurance.
Let's talk about the $15 minimum wage. It's certainly an increase that will help those who do work at that level. What's the real impact of, for Bronx workers?
I think it's
terrific.
And I've taken on all of these so-called business groups who claim that by increasing the minimum wage, we're going to make it very difficult to do business here in New York. It's absolute nonsense. I put a study together when we did the $9 minimum wage increase, which I led the fight for at the time, that actually shows when you raise the minimum wage, you actually help business. A minimum wage worker is not going to have a 401k plan or a stock portfolio, probably not even a bank account. When they get an increase, they spend it, and they usually spend it locally, like on food, on books for their kids, on tuition, for college. These are the things that generate jobs in our economy. I think at the time, the $9 minimum wage was going to increase jobs by about 5,000 in New York State and generate, close to $500 million back into the economy. So I think it's a win-win for everyone.
Some of the workers who make minimum wage live in public housing. If they do, then it raises their income level, and then NYCHA raises their rent. So it's almost like, well, they get a little bit, but they kind of, on balance, don't make out ahead. Again, the impact on the Bronx for the minimum wage, and I'm going to tie it to a question. Would it be ever able to tie something like that to education and say, if you go back to school, if you go to college, you can do better, and kind of tie a minimum wage to that kind of consideration?
You probably could, but I think, getting back to your original question,
Yes.
I think the Bronx probably benefited more than any other county. We have, a disproportionate amount of minimum wage workers, a lot of people who work in the service industry where the jobs seem to be right now. So I think it's going to be a real boom for the Bronx. Also, we're very involved in the healthcare profession. 38% of the people who are employed in the Bronx are employed in the healthcare industry. We also were very mindful of the fact that if you're a hospital, a nursing home, you rely on Medicaid, and Medicaid rates aren't going up. We actually put forth $250 million in the budget. There's going to be a task force meeting to actually now try to make those businesses, especially hospitals, whole, because now they're going to have to pay an increase in the minimum wage, but still rely on none of an increase in Medicaid. So I think this is important as well.
What about that NYCHA idea that I brought up, that some of those people might be kind of running in
Well,
place? You
I
make
think
a little more, and all of a sudden your rent goes up.
You're right, but at the same time, I think, everything else does go up, but this is a substantial increase. Remember, the $15 in New York City is going to happen over the next 3 years. So it's a pretty big jump from $9 to $15 just in 3 years.
Senator, as you know, I live in Mitchell-Lama housing, so I'm personalizing it if I have to, which might be the most successful middle-class housing program
Absolutely
in America.
is.
You have been a big supporter of the concept over the years. I saw, I don't know, a release or something that you were still working at. Is it ever, are we ever going to be able to reinstitute Mitchell-Lama so we have more of them? Because it really is an effective program for stable neighborhoods.
Well, I've tried and I've succeeded. I redeveloped what I call the Mitchell-Lama 2020 program. In last year's budget, we were able to put $50 million into this new Mitchell-Lama program. The way I did it, Gary, was develop a new middle-income tax credit. Remember something, the premise of Mitchell-Lama was give a developer cheap land and a cheap mortgage. Well, there's no cheap land, and mortgages are pretty low already. So now the incentive is this middle-income tax credit, which is a first of its kind. According to the Commission of DHCR, they have people waiting online for this money. It's a small amount because it's a pilot program. I don't know if you heard, Gary, but there's talk that we're going to put together a memorandum of understanding for $2 billion in settlement money for housing. I'm hopeful that I can get $150 million of that money to add to my Mitchell-Lama 2020 program. I want to build thousands of more units, across the state of New York.
And then how would that work? A developer could apply for that?
Correct.
And then
That's really the incentive now for a developer to build, is that middle income tax credit. And what it does, Gary, it allows various income bands to live under one roof. That's the beauty of Mitchell-Lama.
I can vouch for that.
Right,
as you
someone who
well
makes
know.
$40,000 a year and someone who makes $130,000 a year under my program, because I raise I bring the AMI up to 130%. So it makes a lot of sense.
This really cuts to the core of many of the development questions in the Bronx, because people are, of course, yelling for affordable housing, but developers are saying we can't build affordable housing, and then they do the 20-80 split, and you don't really get that kind of diversity.
Yeah, and when you talk about affordable housing, and again, I've been supportive of affordable housing, the program over the years with capital monies. It's not affordable housing, Gary. It's low-income housing. It's under $40,000 a year. So whenever they build a project like that, even a senior project, the seniors who already live in that community are priced out because their income is too high. The beauty of my program is that, yes, that person who makes $40,000 can live there, so can the person who makes $75,000 and $130,000 as well.
Will it be called Mitchell-Lama, do you think?
Mitchell-Lama
It will.
2020.
All right,
yes.
there you go. In all the conversations I've had about gentrification, about all these kinds of issues, for me, the bottom line has always been, how do people who don't make a lot of money make more money? And the answer, of course, is education. Many people are upset because access to quality education is denied people in lower income brackets. They don't get into specialized high schools. They're not trained for specialized high schools. They don't do well on those tests. You've taken a stand on it. I think it's worth talking about access to education.
I recognize that, and it really, these specialized high schools, are our future leaders. The kids who still graduate from these schools, like Bronx Science, here in the Bronx, or Brooklyn Tech or Stuyvesant, are amazing schools. Some of these people become Nobel Prize winners. So I wanted to make sure that minority families, minority kids actually, had more access. 75% of the student body in our public schools are African American and Latino, but 15% are getting into these specialized high schools. I don't think it's about redoing the test. That test has worked to produce smart kids, or at least get smart kids into these schools for generations. It's about tutoring. It's about preparation. So I want to expand the gifted and talented programs, which are that entree into specialized high schools, and I want to actually have test prep programs. You know, every middle-class family now who can afford it is going to make sure their kid is very well versed in this test and actually takes
how would
test
that
prep.
work? I mean, is
We
it
actually
going to the schools with it, or what do you do with it?
Well, first, it's twofold. I think the problem, Gary, is a lot of these kids or parents don't even know these tests exist. I think we have to have them more widely available, especially in inner city neighborhoods, to make sure kids and the parents know about these tests. Then I want to make sure they're prepared. So they're going to have free test prep for these specialized high schools. We spent over $2 million just in the first year on this program. And I guarantee you we're going to get more and more young people, as we should, from African American and Latino communities into these specialized high schools.
We only have just a moment, but I want to ask you another question about access to doing better, which is, in my mind, something so important in the Bronx. This whole idea of justice for job seekers. There are employment agencies that scam immigrants in particular. Talk to me about that aspect, and what do you think?
Yeah, another issue I worked on a couple of years. I'm glad we finally got the legislation done. You know, low-wage workers the ones that were being targeted.
20 seconds. If
Yeah, they're ones being targeted by these employment agencies. You know, taking money for them up front, never getting them a job, which is presently against the law. So we really streamlined the process, made it a lot more transparent, that before someone actually pays any kind of fee, they have to make sure to get a job. And I think that's something important.
All right, now I'm going to put you on the spot. You promise to come back?
I will.
Ah, there it is. We all heard it.
I didn't say when, though.
Well, we'll invite. It's got to be after the election
Okay.
season, because you know
All
that
right.
you'll be running again. Thank you, Senator Klein. There's never enough time. We're always happy that
Pleasure,
you do
Gary.
join us. Okay, folks, if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org, or put them on our Facebook page, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. We ask you to like Bronx Talk on Facebook. Our archives are at BronxNet.org, and you can find Bronx Talk on the lower right navigation bar. Thanks to our producer, Jayla Juberis. Our director is Autumn Vasquez. To the cast of Thousands, and to you, and to the Senator, good night. See you next week.
There's one thing you can never have sex without.
It's not something you buy.
Or something you take.
In fact, there's only one way to get it.
It has to be given to you, freely.
It's consent.
Because sex without it isn't sex.
It's rape. Consent.
If you don't get it, you don't get it. It's on us to stop sexual assault.
Learn how and take the pledge at itsonus.org.
Morning, Gary. We are GetSchooled.com. You want a college education, don't you? Gary, financial aid forms, biology homework, G. Picking a college, man.